Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking John Duke Anthony and Pat Mancino and the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations for putting this event together. It's a pretty bleak picture that has been painted today in terms of the lack of trust between Iran and its Arab neighbors in the Persian-Arabian Gulf region. And the question one has to ask oneself is, so where is this all going? There was a report out by the Atlantic Council by Matthew Burrows called Middle East 2020. And it really portrays a very harrowing picture of where this region is going to be in 5 years' time, in the year 2020, if current trends and current patterns continue. We have a region right now with millions and millions of people driven from their homes, something around 50,000 professional terrorists roaming that region, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, supported by various countries, some of them supported by Arabs, some of them supported by Iranians, some calling them terrorists, some calling them freedom fighters. But large sections of that region are, for the first time in living memory, ungovernable. And the question is, if current patterns continue for the next 5 years, in the year 2020, will it be possible for any of these countries, including the United States, to exert a measure of control over that region? What if instead of 50,000 professional terrorists, you have 100,000 professional terrorists? What if you have, among these people, European passport holders, as we see now, but if we have more of them? What happens then? I remember a few years ago, President Obama was asked about the misery and the devastation that the people in that region have to deal with right now, and he said, well, I look at the world and I see in the Congo, millions of people have been killed in that country's civil war, various civil wars since the late 90s. I think 5 million people is the figure. And when you look at the devastation of, say, Iraq and Syria and that region, maybe it's not as bad, but the problem is that when you have people who are willing to die in the name of God, in the name of religion, these kinds of problems are self-contained, in the way that a lot of the problems, horrifying as they are in Africa, are self-contained. And that's the difference between West Asia, Middle East, and much of the rest of the world, is that people are dying and killing in that region in the name of God, whether it is sectarian violence, whether it's Muslim versus non-Muslim. And so the question for all the members of this triangle, the US, the GCC, and Iran, is what can be done about this? None of these parties can be wished away. And the question then becomes, how can we address the legitimate security concerns of both the Arab and the Persian side of this Gulf, pun intended? And to look at that, one has to go back to the year 2003 and to look at the kind of security perception that Iran has, especially has had since 2003. One has to realize that right around the time the invasion of Iraq was beginning in the late March of 2003, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran sent a 3-page fax to the State Department. This is the last week of March of 2003. And in this 3-page fax, which is reproduced in the book that Barbara Slavin wrote, in this 3-page fax, Iran offered to negotiate with the United States on all issues that were driving them apart, including Iran's support for militant organizations, including Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, including Iran's lack of a relationship with and lack of recognition of Israel, weapons of mass destruction. You look at that fax and you see, boy, during Khatami, not only were Iran-GCC relations improving tremendously, you also had a scenario where, with remarks having made by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in the year 2000, acknowledging some of the difficult history between the two countries, you thought things were headed in the right direction. And Khatami, of course, had a lot of international legitimacy among Arabs and among Americans. that fax was never replied to. And so in Iran, the perception became, well, after Iraq, we're next. That if we are making this kind of an offer, and we're not even getting a reply to this fax, this means that after they're done with Iraq, changing the regime there, we're going to be next. So how can we deal with this? And that's how Iranian foreign policy became militarized, more than ever before, even more than the time of the Iran-Iraq war, because during that time there was no perception that the Americans were coming. Relations with the U.S. weren't good, but there was no fear during the 80s, even during the peak of the Iran-Iraq war, that the Americans are going to be invading. That became the dominant, although unmentioned, undeclared perception in Iran that unless we fight them outside of Iran, we're going to have to fight them inside of Iran. And that began really the process of the militarization of Iranian foreign policy in the form of backing militias across the region, especially in Iraq. And that's how the Revolutionary Guard really stepped up its activities in Iraq to be able to bog down the Americans there instead of inside Iran, to basically make sure that the Americans understand that wars aren't things that you can win easily in that part of the world. That's how the process of militarization began. That's what led to the presidency of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who really came to office, to use a Godfather analogy, as a wartime conciliary, the system expecting that there was going to be a war. But that war with the U.S. thankfully never came. But that mentality could no longer be pulled out of the national psyche and the Iranian government psyche. And so you had, throughout the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, greater and greater militarization of Iranian foreign policy. And you see, for example, and you had the Quds Force, the kind of foreign operations branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, becoming more active, not only in Iraq, but across that region. And the war never came. The war with America never came, but then Iran was constantly preparing for that war during those 8 years. You know, the oil revenues were flowing in to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. There was this sense of the buoyancy of the spirits that came with that, with those resources. The war never came, but then the sanctions came. And so you have now, for example, a situation where last December, with the coordination of a lot of Iranian institutions, you had the Arba'in pilgrimage in Iraq hosting 15 million people. This is last December. This was the largest gathering of people in human history. Never in history had so many millions of people gathered in one place, and the security for this was provided, not all of it, but much of it, again, by the Iranian military. And this is a celebration that's happening in Najaf and Karbala. They call it Bain al-Haramain, between these two holy cities in Shia Islam. And if I were sitting in any of these Arab countries, looking at 15 million people, you know, chanting Ya Hussein, I would find that very troubling. It is a troubling development, because who is behind this? Who is organizing these millions of people to make these kinds of pilgrimages? And so we are where we are right now. The region is in a very, very bad shape. And I believe the only thing that threatens everyone, people in that region and the international community, more than the devastation itself, the only thing that threatens us more than the devastation itself is a sense of learned helplessness, that we can't do anything about it. That we just have to let these wars burn themselves out, you know, until enough people are killed, so that there's just no more willingness or ability to fight. And that's when we don't have that luxury. And especially the United States, this notion that the U.S. just can't do anything, that America's leadership is a thing of the past. These are the real issues that threaten international stability, and they have to be addressed today among all of these countries. There are certain things that all of us have in common, whether we're Americans, Iranians, Arabs, what have you. And the most significant of these is bringing a measure of governability back to this region. And in that light, if I were looking at it from the vantage point of GCC countries, I would welcome an opening between America and Iran, because Iran's threat perception has, for the past 37 years, revolved around enmity towards the United States. Because, Iran hasn't thought that, for example, Qatar or the UAE is going to be invading Iran, but it has thought, especially during the time of the Iraq War, that it was going to be invaded by the U.S. And the best way of getting it to pull back from its pan-Shia, Shia chauvinist ideology is to address its security concerns vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States. It's not going to be an alliance, but it can have the semblance of a normal relationship with dialogue, with an official American presence in Iran. If I were a GCC member, I would welcome that, because Iran would have much less of a reason, in a scenario like that, to be aggressive, to foment Shia militancy across that region. Because it's used that not so much as a matter of ideology, but it's used it as a matter of strategic depth. If you come after me here, I'm going to go after you elsewhere. That's been the logic, and in that light, I'm hoping that our Arab friends and brothers will come to the agreement with much of the rest of the international community that an opening between the U.S. and Iran is to the advantage of GCC countries, because that's how Iran can see a region that isn't opposed to it but can work more closely with it. Thank you very much.